the warrior nuns who defied history, Buddhism's forgotten female fighters. In a mountain cave somewhere in Tibet, a woman sits in meditation. Around her waist, not prayer beads, but a sword. In her hands, not offerings of incense, but the reins of a war horse. This is not a contradiction. This is history. For 2,500 years, Buddhism has been synonymous with peace, compassion, and non-violence. Yet hidden in the mountains of Tibet, buried in ancient texts, and deliberately obscured by history, lived women who embodied a different Buddhist truth, warriors who fought, not despite their spiritual path, but because of it. Women who led armies, women who defeated demons, women who transformed the act of violence itself into a path to enlightenment. Their names were recorded, their deeds were celebrated, and then, slowly, systematically, they were erased. This is the story of three women whose existence challenges everything we think we know about Buddhism, gender, and power. This is the story of the female warrior nuns Buddhism created and then tried to make us forget. Hit that subscribe button if you want more content like this. It takes 1 second and helps to support this channel. Act 1. The Paradox of the Peaceful Warrior. Setting the stage. According to historical records, Buddhism arrived in Tibet in the 7th century CE under King Songtsen Gampo, who sent his minister to India to study Buddhist texts and develop a written Tibetan language. Yet from its very beginning, Tibetan Buddhism faced a unique challenge. How could a religion of peace take root in a warrior culture? The answer lies in a concept that Western minds struggle to grasp. The idea that compassion itself could be fierce. That protecting the Dharma, the Buddhist teachings, might require not passive acceptance, but active defense. This created space for a particular kind of practitioner, the spiritual warrior. What history has largely forgotten is that some of the most powerful of these warriors were women. The historical context. Archaeological evidence suggests that Buddhist culture in China developed a tradition of fully ordained female monastics, bhikkhuni, as early as the 4th century. In Tibet, women participated in Buddhism from its inception, though contemporary inscriptions rarely mentioned individual women by name, a pattern of historical erasure that began early. The few women who broke through this silence did so by achieving something undeniable, spiritual mastery so profound that even patriarchal institutions could not ignore it. But three women went further. They combined spiritual achievement with physical prowess, creating legacies that would influence all schools of Tibetan Buddhism, even as later traditions downplayed their warrior aspects. Act 2. Yeshe Tsogyal, the mother of Tibetan Buddhism. The legend versus history. Yeshe Tsogyal's story begins with an important historical caveat. There are no contemporary 8th century inscriptions that definitively confirm her existence. As scholar Janet Gyatso notes, none of the contemporary epigraphy ever mentions a Yeshe Tsogyal, nor a Makar Chun Ra, her clan title. However, Gyatso also observes that Yeshe Tsogyal appears in historical accounts at a relatively early point, by at least the 12th century. In the mythologized accounts of the conversion of Tibet, and N, references to her clan title make her historicity credible. It is entirely possible, according to historical analysis, that an aristocratic woman became involved in Buddhist practices during the 8th century, even if her story was greatly elaborated over time. What matters for our story is understanding why Tibetans created and preserved this particular narrative, and what it reveals about female power in Buddhist Tibet, the story they tell. According to tradition, Yeshe Tsogyal was born around 757 CE as a princess of the Karshan clan. Legend states she was born in the same miraculous manner as the Buddha himself, and her birth caused a nearby lake to double in size. Hence her name, which means Wisdom Lake Queen, or Victorious Ocean of Knowledge. From her earliest years, historical texts describe her as spiritually inclined and resistant to marriage. At 16, she was compelled into an arranged marriage with Emperor Trisong Detsen. This emperor, according to historical records, invited the Indian master Padmasambhava to Tibet to establish Buddhism. In a move that reveals the complex status of women in that era, Yeshe Tsogyal was offered to Padmasambhava as a mandala offering during an initiation ceremony, the warrior training. What happened next transforms her from royal consort to warrior practitioner. Padmasambhava, recognizing her spiritual potential, freed her from her status as a gift and accepted her as his primary disciple and spiritual consort. Historical texts record her undergoing extreme ascetic practices in mountain caves and cemeteries, places traditionally associated with fearlessness training in Tibetan Buddhism. According to her Namthar spiritual biography, she faced trials including solitary meditation retreats in terrifying locations, confrontations with bandits. One account describes her converting 7 bandits to Buddhism, physical assault and rape, which she is said to have transformed into opportunities for spiritual realization, beheading a tiger in ritual combat. The tiger story deserves closer examination. In Tibetan Buddhism, the tiger often symbolizes anger and aggression. Whether literal or metaphorical, this account portrays Yeshe Tsogyal as someone who confronted and conquered violence through direct engagement, not passive acceptance. The spiritual warrior's weapon. When Padmasambhava was asked about Yeshe Tsogyal's inferior female body, a common concern in Buddhist texts of the era, historical records attribute to him this revolutionary response. The basis for realizing enlightenment is a human body. Male or female, there is no great difference. This teaching became foundational for Tibetan Buddhism's relatively progressive stance on women's spiritual potential. But Yeshe Tsogyal went beyond receiving this teaching. She embodied it through action. Historical accounts credit her with mastering the practice of Vajrakalaya, a wrathful deity associated with overcoming obstacles, serving as the primary scribe for treasured texts, dharma, that would be hidden for future generations, having 11 main disciples, both male and female, eventually attaining full Buddhahood, described as flying directly to the pure land of Zangdo at her death, the legacy and the erasure. Today, Yeshe Tsogyal remains revered in the 9 school of Tibetan Buddhism. She is invoked in prayers and visualized in meditation practices. Yet notice what has been emphasized over centuries: her role as scribe, as consort, as mother figure to Tibetan Buddhism. What is rarely discussed in mainstream Buddhist teachings? Her warrior training, her confrontations with bandits and demons, her practice of wrathful deity yoga, the fact that compassion for her included the capacity for fierce protection. She has been remembered but sanitized, domesticated, made safe for a tradition that increasingly emphasized nonviolence over fierce compassion. Act 3, Machig Labdrön, the woman who challenged India, the historical record. With Machig Labdrön, 1055 to 1149, we move from legend into documented history. Multiple historical sources from the 11th and 12th centuries confirm her existence, her teachings, and her extraordinary influence. The Blue Annals and other Tibetan historical chronicles provide detailed accounts of her life that can be cross-referenced. Born in Labchi in southern Tibet, Machig Labdrön represents a unique phenomenon in Buddhist history. She is the only Tibetan woman credited with founding an entire school of Buddhist practice. Chod, literally cutting through, or severance. That was then exported back to India, reversing the usual flow of Buddhist teachings. The early prodigy. Historical records describe Machig as a child prodigy who by age 13 had lost her mother and was traveling with her sister to study with the great Buddhist teachers of her time. According to historical accounts, she became renowned for her ability to recite the Prajnaparamita, perfection of wisdom, sutras, complex texts on the nature of emptiness, with such speed and comprehension that she surpassed her own teachers. Around age 20, a teacher named Kyotan Sonam Lama challenged her intellectual achievements by suggesting she move beyond mere recitation and conceptual understanding to investigate her own mind directly. During a reading about demons, historical texts record that Machig achieved direct realization of the teaching's meaning, an experience that would transform not just her life, but the practice of Buddhism itself. The path of the outcast warrior. What happened next is documented in multiple historical sources. Machig abandoned the comfortable life of a respected scholar and took up the lifestyle of a wandering beggar. She associated with lepers and outcasts, precisely the people respectable Buddhist practitioners avoided. She slept anywhere, ate anything, and deliberately sought out frightening and uncomfortable situations. This was not self-punishment. This was warrior training. At age 23, she met Topabhadra, an Indian practitioner who became her spiritual consort and the father of her children. Sources vary on whether she had 2, 3, or 5 children. According to historical records, when they first came together, witnesses reported seeing rainbow light streaming from their dwelling, as though the house had caught on fire, described in Buddhist texts as a sign of advanced tantric realization. But motherhood brought social rejection. The same society that had celebrated her scholarship now shunned her. Historical accounts describe a period of extreme poverty, with Machig and her small family wandering through Tibet, often facing starvation, the practice that changed Buddhism. During these years of hardship, Machig developed and formalized Chod, a practice that remains marginal and peripheral, as Wikipedia's article on Chod describes it, even within Tibetan Buddhism, precisely because of its radical nature. Chod combines visualization, ritual, music, using a damaru drum and kangling trumpet made from human thigh bone, and the practitioner's confrontation with their deepest fears. The core practice involves 1. Going to frightening places, traditionally charnel grounds and cemeteries. 2. Visualizing offering one's own body to demons, spirits, and negative forces. 3. Using this imaginal self-sacrifice to cut through ego attachment. 4. Transforming fear and adversity into fuel for awakening. As Machig herself said, according to historical records, to consider adversity as a friend is the instruction of Chod. This was warrior training for the mind, confronting inner demons by offering them everything, including your own flesh. It was fierce compassion made practice, the ultimate validation. The most extraordinary event in Max's historical record occurred when she was 52 years old. Word of her teachings had reached India, the homeland of Buddhism, and the Indian scholarly establishment was scandalized. How could an authentic Buddhist teaching originate in Tibet, and from a woman no less? According to multiple historical sources, 3 Indian pundits, scholars, traveled to Tibet to investigate. At a gathering that historical records claim included 500,573 people, likely a symbolic rather than literal number, Machig engaged in formal philosophical debate with the Indian scholars. The proceedings were translated into Tibetan, Hindi, and Nepali. Machig did something remarkable. She described her previous incarnation as an Indian monk named Mon Lam Drub. To prove this claim, she gave precise instructions for finding the corpse of her previous body in a cave in India and described specific signs that would appear when it was cremated. Historical texts record that the Indians followed her instructions, found the preserved body exactly where she described, and witnessed the predicted auspicious signs, including a sweet smell, rainbow light, and sacred symbols appearing on the bones. Whether we interpret this as proof of reincarnation, as elaborate legend, or as a brilliant political strategy to authenticate her teachings, the result was clear. The Indian scholars accepted the validity of Chod. For the first and only time, according to historical records, a Buddhist teaching created in Tibet by a Tibetan woman was accepted as authentic by the Indian Buddhist establishment. Machig was invited to teach in India. She refused, according to historical sources, maintaining her commitment to the Tibetan people and affirming that her lineage belonged to Tibet, the empire she built. By age 37, Machig had established Zangri Kangmer, the Red House of Copper Mountain, which remained her teaching seat until her death at age 99. Archaeological and historical evidence confirms this monastery existed and became a significant center of Buddhist practice. Her students numbered in the thousands and came from all levels of Tibetan society: lamas, geshes, monks, nuns, kings, queens, ministers, chiefs, and lay people, including lepers and beggars, according to historical records. Her youngest son, Tunyan, became the main holder of her lineage. Machig's Chod teachings influenced all schools of Tibetan Buddhism. The practice remains alive today in Tibetan Buddhist communities worldwide. The Erasure pattern. Yet ask a typical Western Buddhist practitioner about Machig Labdrön. Many will have never heard of her. Those who have will likely know her as a yogini or spiritual adept, not as the founder of a major practice lineage that directly challenged patriarchal structures and violent egotism. Her practice of going to charnel grounds, confronting death and fear directly, is often explained as purely symbolic, an internal imaginal environment, as Wikipedia's article states. The fierce, confrontational, warrior-like aspects of her path have been softened in modern presentations. She has been remembered, but her edge has been dulled. Act 4. Ani Pachen, the nun who raised an army. From legend to living memory. With Ani Pachen, 1933 to 2002, we move from ancient and medieval history into the fully documented modern era. Her story is recorded in her autobiography, Sorrow Mountain, in historical accounts of the Tibetan resistance against Chinese occupation, and in the memories of people still living today. Ani Pachen was born Lemda Pachen in 1933, the only child of the chieftain of the Lemda clan in Ganzhou, Kham Province, Tibet. In 1950, the People's Republic of China invaded Tibet. According to historical records, Tibet had a small army with no professional military training. The invasion would change everything, including transforming a Buddhist nun into a warrior. The reluctant chieftain. At 17, according to her autobiography and historical accounts, Pachen's father arranged her marriage to another clan's chieftain, arguing she would need help governing after his death. Unwilling to accept marriage, she fled to a Buddhist monastery and was ordained as a nun, receiving the name Ani Pachen, nun big courage. The name proved prophetic. 6 months later, her father called her home, not to force marriage, but to train her as his heir. She obeyed, though given the choice, she wrote, she would have stayed at the monastery and continued her spiritual practice. This tension between spiritual calling and worldly duty defines her story and illuminates a central Buddhist teaching, that sometimes compassion requires action, not retreat. The warrior nun emerges. When her father fell ill and died in 1958, the 25-year-old Ani Pachen became chieftain of the Lemda clan. Historical accounts document that the Chinese occupation had become increasingly brutal, confiscating property, killing landowners, establishing communes, and bringing Chinese settlers into Tibetan territories. Pachen's father had regularly met with other local leaders to discuss resistance strategies. According to historical records from Pamela Toller's Women Warriors, An Unexpected History, Pachen joined these meetings, though she never felt entirely accepted. Other leaders watched her when they thought she wasn't looking, with a mixture of curiosity, disbelief, and dismay on their faces, as if they thought their meetings were no place for a woman. Yet when her father died, Pachen made a decision that embodied a profound Buddhist paradox. She concluded that the only way to save Buddhist pacifism in Tibet was to go to war. In early 1959, historical records confirm that Ani Pachen led 600 resistance fighters from her clan into the mountains on horseback, armed with guns and swords. They were not a professional military force. They were farmers, herders, and monks who had taken up arms to protect their way of life. The Mountain Campaign. For 2 years, Pachen's forces used guerrilla tactics in the mountainous terrain, ambushing Chinese convoys and destroying Chinese camps. Historical accounts record an incident where a Chinese officer sent her a letter, written in Tibetan, attempting to buy her surrender. "Return to your family, and I will guarantee that nothing will happen to your possessions. Furthermore, if you surrender all the weapons, you will be awarded an appropriate rank for your deeds." According to her later testimony, far from being tempted to surrender, she was outraged. This detail is telling. The Chinese assumed she could be bought, that a woman leading warriors was motivated by personal gain or could be convinced to abandon her people for safety. They fundamentally misunderstood what they faced: a Buddhist practitioner for whom protecting the dharma and protecting her people had become inseparable. Captured, not defeated. In 1960, Chinese forces captured Pachen as she fled with her mother, aunt, and grandmother toward India. In testimony later reported in Shambhala Sun magazine, she described the interrogation. "When they arrested me, they bound my hands and feet and hung me upside down and interrogated me. They beat me continuously. I would pass out, and they would throw water on me and beat me some more." What followed was 21 years in Chinese prisons, during which historical accounts record she was shackled, tortured, and subjected to long periods of solitary confinement. 21 years. Think about that duration. Most Western prison sentences for violent crimes don't approach that length. She was imprisoned longer than many murderers served for the crime of defending her people and her faith. The Unbroken Spirit. Released in 1981 with orders to return to Ganzhou, Pachen instead went to Lhasa, where for 7 years she evaded official notice while participating in demonstrations against Chinese rule. In 1988, when she received word of imminent arrest, she finally escaped to India, eventually making her way to the West. She spent her remaining years sharing her story, advocating for Tibetan freedom, and teaching that even in the darkest circumstances, the human spirit, grounded in Buddhist practice, could remain unbroken. Ani Pachen died in 2002. Unlike Yeshe Tsogyal and Machig Labdrön, whose stories have been told and retold for centuries, Pachen's legacy is still being written. Her autobiography remains in print. People who knew her are still alive. A modern erasure. Yet here's the painful truth. Outside Tibet and communities of Tibetan Buddhism, almost no one knows her name. Her story doesn't fit comfortable narratives about Buddhism as purely peaceful, about nuns as passive, about women as needing rescue rather than being rescuers. When the West thinks of Tibetan Buddhism, we think of the Dalai Lama's gentle smile, not Ani Pachen leading 600 warriors on horseback. We think of meditation cushions, not prison cells where a nun endured decades of torture without breaking. She is the most recent erasure, and perhaps the most complete. Act 5. The Pattern of Erasure. Why were they forgotten? 3 women, 3 different centuries, 3 different expressions of fierce compassion, all extraordinary, all influential in their time, yet all, in different ways, diminished or erased from popular understanding of Buddhist history. The pattern isn't accidental. According to scholars like Bernard Fauré and Miranda Shaw, Buddhist studies remain in its infancy in terms of addressing gender issues. Historian Garima Kaushik notes that despite clear archaeological evidence of women's prominent roles in early Buddhist sites, the marked feminine presence has often been overlooked or minimized. Several forces contributed to this erasure. 1. The monastic narrative dominance. As Buddhism became institutionalized, monastic lineages, overwhelmingly male, controlled which stories were preserved and how they were told. Chod Machig's practice was described by Wikipedia as marginal and peripheral. practiced by those from outside traditional Tibetan Buddhist and Indian monastic institutions. The establishment literally categorized practices developed by women as peripheral. 2. The peace narrative. Modern Buddhism, especially as taught in the West, emphasizes peace, mindfulness, and stress reduction. Stories of women confronting bandits, leading armies, or practicing in charnel grounds don't fit this comfortable narrative. They're inconvenient truths. 3. The gender paradox. Buddhist texts from multiple traditions contain what scholars call deeply ambivalent attitudes toward women, mixing genuine respect for female spiritual achievement with underlying misogyny. As Wikipedia's article on women in Buddhism notes, texts often depict women as obstructors of men's spiritual progress while simultaneously acknowledging female masters. Warrior women pose a particular problem. They demonstrate that women can wield power, spiritual and physical, without male mediation or approval. This threatens patriarchal structures, Buddhist or otherwise. 4. The colonial and modern gaze. When Western scholars and practitioners encountered Tibetan Buddhism in the 20th century, they brought their own assumptions about what Buddhism should be: peaceful, meditative, and what women should be: gentle, supportive. Stories that challenged these assumptions were often dismissed as legend or mythology, rather than engaged with complex historical narratives. What was lost? When we erase the warrior women of Buddhism, we lose more than inspiring stories. We lose theological complexity, the understanding that compassion can be fierce, that protecting the vulnerable might require force, that non-attachment includes non-attachment to pacifism itself. Female empowerment models. Examples of women who wielded power, spiritual and temporal, on their own terms. Historical accuracy. The truth that Buddhism has always been more diverse, complex, and pragmatic than simplified modern presentations suggest. Spiritual practices. Like Chod, which remains marginal partly because its fierce, confrontational nature challenges comfortable Buddhism. Act 6. Why this matters now. The relevance of fierce compassion. In our current moment, facing climate crisis, authoritarianism, systemic oppression, and violence, the stories of Yeshe Tsogyal, Machig Labdrön, and Ani Pachen offer something essential that sanitized Buddhism cannot: permission to be spiritually serious and effectively fierce. These women understood something profound, that true compassion sometimes requires confronting harm directly, that protecting the dharma, the teachings, the community, the possibility of awakening might demand more than meditation cushions and peaceful wishes. Ani Pachen faced an impossible choice: abandon her people to brutalization or take up arms against overwhelming force. She chose to fight, not from anger or hatred, but from the same compassionate impulse that led her to become a nun in the first place. That's not a contradiction. That's Buddhism. Recovering the lineage. Contemporary Buddhist scholars and practitioners are beginning to recover these stories. As Wikipedia's article on women in Buddhism notes, recent decades have seen increased ordination of female monastics, establishment of women's dharma centers, and growing academic attention to female Buddhist figures. Projects like the Women Ancestors document mentioned in Grace Shireson work are bringing attention to the forgotten names and voices of women in the tradition. Organizations like the Bhutan Nuns Foundation work to empower contemporary female monastics. But this recovery remains incomplete. Mainstream presentations of Buddhism still overwhelmingly emphasize male teachers, peaceful practices, and docile images of female practitioners. The challenge to modern Buddhism. These three women challenge us, as practitioners, as scholars, as people interested in Buddhism, to ask hard questions. Have we made Buddhism safe at the cost of making it shallow? Do we honor women's spiritual achievements only when they fit comfortable stereotypes? What practices, teachings, and truths have we lost by erasing the fierce feminine? Can we hold the complexity of a tradition that includes both absolute nonviolence and the warrior spirit? The invitation. The story of Buddhism's warrior women is not a story about violence being good or about glorifying warfare. It's a story about the full spectrum of compassionate responses to suffering and threat. Sometimes compassion looks like meditation on loving kindness. Sometimes it looks like beheading your inner tiger. Sometimes it looks like offering your body to demons in visualization. Sometimes it looks like it is leading 600 warriors to protect your people, knowing you'll likely be captured, tortured, and imprisoned for decades. The question these women ask us across centuries is simple and devastating. How much are you willing to risk protecting what you love? Their lives answer, everything. Conclusion. In a mountain cave somewhere in Tibet, a woman sits in meditation. Around her waist, not prayer beads, but a sword. In her hands, not offerings of incense, but the reins of a war horse. This is not a contradiction. This is the truth Buddhism tried to make us forget. Yeshe Tsogyal, Machig Labdrön, Ani Pachen. 3 names, 3 warriors. 3 women who proved that the feminine spirit, grounded in Buddhist practice, could be simultaneously fierce and compassionate, powerful and humble, warrior and saint. They were not erased completely. Their stories survived in texts, in lineages, in the practices that continue today. But they were diminished, sanitized, made safer for consumption by traditions and cultures uncomfortable with female power. Now you know their names. Now you know their stories. The only question that remains is, what will you do with this knowledge? Will you allow them to be erased again? Or will you carry their legacy forward? The legacy of fierce compassion, of spiritual warriorship, of women who refuse to be limited by others' expectations of what Buddhism should be, what women should be, what compassion should look like. The choice, as always, is yours. But know this, somewhere in the mountains, the warrior women are still sitting in meditation, and they are still armed. Note on historical accuracy. This narrative distinguishes between verified historical facts, legendary accounts, and scholarly debate. Where historicity is questioned, particularly regarding Yeshe Tsogyal, this is explicitly acknowledged. All specific claims about dates, events, and quotations are drawn from cited historical sources, with careful attention noting when sources conflict or when accounts may be hagiographic rather than strictly historical. In the video description below is a list of historical and academic sources from which this story was created. Until next time, walk in peace.